Happy Migraine Awareness Month, everyone. I hope you are learning lots of things you didn't know about migraine. That's what we're trying to do, is lift awareness and your understanding and empowerment of how you can manage your own migraine journey. From time to time, you'll hear me talk about how the migraine brain is structurally different to other brains. Now, that's based on research that's being done using functional MRI, and we've got one of the researchers that works in this area to talk to us today, Dr Noemi Meylakh from Sydney University. How are you doing?
Hi, good, thanks. How are you?
Very well. Thank you for joining us. Now, we better start with the basics. So what is functional MRI? Most of us have had an MRI, but what is functional MRI?
Do you mean like most of us have had an MRI in terms of like a structural scan, just to get an MRI structural scan, just to ensure that there's nothing kind of malignant going on in the brain first. So that's probably what you mean by normal MRI.
Yeah.
Whilst a functional MRI is kind of something you get more for research purposes. And it basically measures neural activity in specific regions of the brain. And that's due to flow of blood to those regions.
Right.
And there's the assumption that blood flow will go to certain regions when there's an increase in activity. So that's kind of the index that is used to kind of measure differences in signal in different, I guess, phases of the migraine and in non-migraine brains.
Okay, cool.
That answers the question.
Yeah, so basically the normal MRIs, or the MRIs that our neurologists send us off to have, is just to look for anything structural, but functional MRIs is actually looking at blood flow around the brain.
Basically, to try and measure neural activity and changes in neural activity, usually for a study of a specific condition, or to compare a condition to what's called a control brain. So people without that condition, to try and compare the differences.
Alrighty, so tell us about your research. What have you found that's different about the migraine brain?
So basically, one of my main findings has been that changes in functional connectivity in the migraine brain is not static, in that it changes over the migraine cycle. And the migraine cycle can be split into 4 different parts. So there's the 24-hour period before a migraine. There's the actual migraine headache, which can go up to 3 days. Then there's kind of a 3 days recovery period. And then there's what's called like the interictal kind of period, where a migraine is not in close proximity. So our studies have found that in the 24 hours before a migraine, that's when the most change in activity is present. So there's basically this huge increase in kind of functional differences, and that these changes return to normal in the interictal period. And when I say normal, I mean like a non-migraine brain.
All right. So our brains function roughly the same between attacks, or are they different all the time?
Sorry, do you mean like different to...
In the interactal phase, are they different to a neurotypical brain generally all the time, or is it only during the attack phases?
Yeah, so generally we found that it's more closely resembling a neurotypical brain in the interictal, and that the massive increase in activity is seen just before, during, and just after a migraine, a headache. So kind of the closer in proximity a headache is, the more dysfunctional the activity in the brain.
Dysfunctional being that medical word, meaning it's not typical, not that it's necessarily dysfunctional, like in the common meaning.
Kind of like, like basically meaning that there's something that's triggered a massive increase in certain activity of certain regions that have then gone on to lead to a headache.
Yep. Okay. So when you're looking at a migraine brain during an attack, or during, that prodrome phase or the premonitory phase, the 24 hours before a migraine attack is really kicking in, what are the different kind of things that you see? Is it just more activity, or is it activity in certain areas?
So basically we see a massive increase in activity in regions of the pain modulating pathways. And those are specific regions in the brainstem. So there are regions in the brainstem that are kind of known or theorized to modulate pain. So basically they control the, they kind of can inhibit pain or lead to an excitation of pain. And so they send messages up to the rest of the brain to kind of lead to the experience of a headache.
Okay.
So we found that in those regions, increase in activity.
Awesome. All right. So it's a lot about the brainstem, and can that be like a trigger in and of itself, that activity around the brainstem?
I'm kind of wary to comment too much on a trigger because all I've really been able to look at is what's happening and where it's happening. I can't really comment on why. That's why we're continuously conducting studies to try and understand why, like sometimes even with the same trigger, a lot of migraine sufferers will say that sometimes a trigger will lead to a headache and sometimes it won't. So even triggers, acting as triggers is not consistent, which is what always led us to believe that there's kind of an intrinsic cycle, perhaps in the brainstem, where if the cycle is vulnerable, at a vulnerable point, then a trigger would be successful in ascending to trigger a headache. Whilst if it happens to coincide with a strong part of the cycle, the brainstem is then able to fight off any triggers that would stop any of that usual kind of activity that we see in the prodromal stage, and therefore a headache wouldn't occur.
Okay. So do you see,
yeah.
So from the studies that you see, do you see any physical or structural impact on the brain from migraine attacks?
Again, I'm a bit wary to comment on that because it's a whole chicken and egg question. I personally haven't conducted the structural scans. There was another PhD student who was doing her PhD alongside me that was running a lot of the structural scans, and we have found that there are structural differences in a lot of the same regions. I found functional differences. So that's basically kind of supporting this idea that the migraine brain does have structural differences in a lot of these important pain processing regions. But again, we don't know if that could be underlying the migraine attacks or whether these migraine attacks, including increased frequency and severity, has then led to this change in structure. So again, we're not able to comment on that unless we scanned people before they developed migraine. But that's, as you know, probably very difficult.
Given the idea that it is genetic, if you accept that, then it's kind of going to be impossible. Yeah. Alrighty. So there's a lot of really cool MRI and fMRI research being done about the structure of the brain and the function of the brain. What do you think is the most important finding so far, either from your own work or other work in the area, that you think can enhance our understanding of migraine?
I think that the role of the hypothalamus in the initiation of a migraine attack is very important. So the hypothalamus is a region, it's just above the brainstem, so it's kind of in the middle of the brain. And it's kind of like the homeostatic system. So basically it's this part of the brain that basically makes sure that everything's in balance, and it controls many different mechanisms, and it also interacts with lots of different regions. And we found quite consistently that activity in the hypothalamus gets dysregulated or increased or basically changes in the 24 hours before a migraine attack. So I think that if we understand better the activity of this region and why it decides to spontaneously change, and why the balance of the brain changes, that could be very important in predicting a migraine attack and also maybe preventing them from occurring.
Interesting.
And
so
also treatments
can then be developed
region,
targeting the hypothalamus. Yeah, that would be really interesting.
Yeah, there are a lot of symptoms such as dehydration, thirst, changes in body temperature, changes in appetite, changes in sleep cycle, all these different things that people experience that can be attributed to dysregulation of the hypothalamic role. So whether this is the initiating quality or whether something happens to cause this to happen in the hypothalamus, we don't know. But I do believe that this is a very important finding.
Yeah, it's a particularly fascinating one to me because half of my hypothalamus is missing. So,
oh, really?
Yeah, I don't know why. It's there's like a very large scar in the middle of my MRI, and it pervades kind of about 2/3 of my hypothalamus. So I'm going to be very interested to see what else you come up with along those lines.
Have you had a functional MRI before?
No, no.
That'd be really interesting to see.
I'll be a guinea pig. That's totally fine. Yeah, look, I've been told it's not a thing because apparently, you know, my brain has managed to work without it, and there is still a bit of hypothalamus there. But yeah, it's one of those like really big holes in the middle of your brain. If I don't tell the MRI guys before they do a scan, they tend to freak out and think there's something really, really wrong. It's old. It's been there forever. It's been completely stable on scans for more than 10 years. So yeah, but maybe one day you can do a functional MRI and see what's going on there. More than happy to be a guinea pig. I just wanted to touch on one thing because this conversation comes up a little bit. So you are very comfortable kind of talking about the migraine brain versus a neurotypical brain. The concept of neurodiversity is very much attached to the autism community. Do you think migraine is a form of neurodiversity? Do you think it's appropriate to call it that?
I guess in a way, yes. It is affecting many people. Like in Australia, it would be affecting millions and millions of people. And I think that it is often misunderstood, and people with migraine suffer from a lack of understanding from people. So people think it's just a bad headache, basically, and that is not an excuse. Whilst people that suffer from migraines know that if you're in a migraine, often you cannot, like, it is debilitating. You can't go to work, you can't drive, often you can't even open your eyes, you can't even be in a light room. And I think that if there's more of an understanding and an acceptance that people with migraine do have, I guess, this neurodiverse brain that is underlying periods of discomfort and these migraine attacks, there would be more acceptance and more understanding of them. I'm actually quite surprised at the lack of awareness because it affects so many people. I think a lot of people suffer quietly and they kind of just get on with it because people think it's just a bad headache, and I hear it all the time. And I myself really understood, like, even I was 2 years into my PhD and I heard all these different stories and I'm like, well, you know, must be pretty bad. And then once I had a migraine, it was like my 3rd year of PhD, and I was debilitated for an entire day. And then I thought, you know what, I'm kind of glad this happened because now I can actually empathize with them and understand in a way after one day how they can't really go on with their day.
Yeah. Once you get it, you get it. So how did you come to do a whole PhD in migraine without living with migraine in the first place?
I was doing an honours degree in the neural imaging laboratory at University of Sydney, and I was doing actually an honours thesis on personality and serotonin and the role of serotonin and the serotonergic pathway. So it's completely unrelated. And then towards the end of my supervisor just received a lot of funding to start a new project on migraine. And I started reading up on it and kind of started getting more and more interested. And I said that I would be more than happy to take it on. So I spent 4 years completing the PhD in migraine, which completely opened my eyes to, oh my God, the amount of people that suffer from them. After people like found out that I'm doing a PhD in it, every second or third person was like, oh, I suffer from migraine. There's 2 days a week where I'm completely debilitated. these are people that I've known for years that I never even knew this about, because it's kind of not considered a condition that you, like, I kind of, to a lot of people, doesn't seem like a legitimate condition to talk about.
Yeah,
And
it's a big problem. You know, and part of the reason why we do things like Migraine Awareness Month is to get people to talk about their migraine. And you will soon find that every second person is part of the community. Yeah. So that's
we're starting a chronic migraine study.
Oh, you are? Great. What? Tell us about it, or what you can.
So we're actually scanning down in Melbourne, because in Melbourne there is a 7 Tesla MRI. So whilst most MRIs is 3 Tesla, so that basically means how strong the magnet is. So basically gives you much more higher definition images. And so we fly down to Melbourne, and we have a collaboration there where recruitment of chronic migraine patients is occurring through a neurologist. So basically, chronic migraine sufferers suffer from more than 15 headaches a month, with at least 8 of them being considered migraine headaches. So basically, every 2 days they're in pain. And from what I said earlier about the different phases, they would never enter an interictal phase. It would always be prodrome or during a headache, maybe one day after a headache, and then back to prodrome. Like, it's kind of this constant cycle where the frequency and severity of migraines is just increased for some sort of reason. And we're finding that chronic migraine sufferers, there used to be episodic migraine sufferers, so they were not always experiencing like these 15 headaches a month. It used to be once a week, used to be once a month. And then like a whole array of different factors has caused the development of chronic migraine. So we're trying to understand the mechanisms behind this transformation. And we're also trying to increase awareness about the fact that these are actually 2 distinctive conditions. So a lot of the time people think chronic migraine is a chronic version of migraine, of episodic migraine, but it's actually not. We're finding that a lot of the underlying mechanisms are different. And this is really, really important, because it means that treatments would be tailored specifically to chronic migraine. And the reason this is so important is because a lot of people who suffer from episodic migraine, they start taking all these medications. And this is often medication overuse is one of the main factors that leads to chronic migraine, because it's kind of like this secondary issue of like this dependence on this medication.
Yeah, and the headaches the result.
Yeah. And then these chronic migraine sufferers end up taking these medications that are for episodic migraine that are actually not for people that suffer from such frequency and severity as they do. And it just perpetuates this vicious cycle for them. Why migraines transform to chronic, and then also understanding the underlying neural activity behind them would lead to tailored treatments.
Yeah, and conversely, we can then push back against the limitation of the new CGRP medications to chronic migraine, because they weren't designed or made for chronic migraine, they were made for migraine. So I think that's really, really important work. Please do let us know about the study and who we can send people to, because I'm quite sure that you will have lots and lots of volunteers for the Migraine Australia team.
That'd be great.
So much for talking to us. I'm so excited by all of your research. We want to hear about it all of the time. And I hope you have a very happy Migraine Awareness Month.
Thank you. Lovely to meet you.